In the late autumn of 2023, in a Louisiana parish that was slowly forgetting its own name, a 72-year-old woman named Elara Benoit sold her rice harvest for $98,450. This was not the most money any farmer in St. Amelie Parish made that year, not in gross revenue, but she had spent only $1,120 to produce it, and she had grown it on 40 acres of brackish swamp that had been struck from the parish agricultural rolls 30 years prior, sold to her for the delinquent tax value of $15,750. The land was considered not just worthless, but a liability, a place where things went to sink and be forgotten. They had laughed when she signed the papers at the courthouse in March of 2021. 3 years later, no one was laughing. They were just watching the numbers on the co-op board, trying to understand how they had been so wrong. To understand what happened, you have to go back, not just to 2021, but further. Let me tell you about the land, because that's where the story begins. The 40 acres sat at the parish's lowest point, a shallow bowl where Bayou Teche and a smaller, unnamed coulee would spill their banks every third or fourth spring. It was 5 miles south of the town of Alamand, down a gravel road that turned to mud 8 months of the year. For generations, it was known as the Broussard Sump. The Broussard family had tried to farm it in the 1920s, lost 2 tractors to the muck, and gave up. In the 1950s, a developer bought it with a plan to dredge it for a fishing camp, went bankrupt after digging a 100-foot trench, and forfeited the land to the bank. The bank couldn't sell it. The parish eventually took ownership for non-payment of taxes in 1991. For 30 years, it sat there, a blank spot on the map, populated by cypress knees, water moccasins, and alligators. The soil was a black, peaty gumbo with a pH of 5.2, far too acidic for the commercial rice varieties that dominated the parish. The water table was, in most places, less than 6 inches from the surface. It was, by every modern agricultural metric, a catastrophic piece of real estate. Elara Benoit was 72 years old when she bought it. She had been a farmer's wife for 48 years and a farmer's widow for 4. She was known for 2 things: her unwavering silence in church and the precision of her needlepoint. She was a small woman, under 5 feet tall, with hands gnarled by a life of work. Her posture was permanently stooped, as if she were perpetually leaning over a garden bed. She did not own a computer. She did not own a smartphone. She owned the 12-acre plot her husband had left her, a 1998 Ford Ranger with 247,000 miles on the odometer, and a small cloth bag that her great-grandmother, Celestine, had carried from Acadia. Let me tell you about that bag. It was not burlap. It was woven from a material no one could identify anymore. A soft but durable linen-like fabric, dyed a deep indigo with something that never faded. Inside the bag was just under 2 pounds of rice seed. The grains were unlike anything grown in the parish. They were long, slender, and when uncooked, they were the color of polished jet. This was the Benoit Noir, the black rice of her family. The story, passed down from mother to daughter, was that Celestine had hidden the seed in the hem of her dress when she was exiled. It was a rice that didn't just tolerate water, it loved it. It thrived in the acidic, low-oxygen soil of coastal wetlands. It grew tall and slow, untroubled by the pests that plagued modern dwarf varieties. For 5 generations, the Benoit women had maintained the seed stock, growing just enough each year in a small, hidden paddy behind their home to keep the line pure. It was never sold. It was never shared outside the family. It was an inheritance, more vital than land, more precious than money. It was a living library of genetic memory, a quiet testament to a different way of understanding the earth. When Elara's husband, Jean-Paul, was alive, he farmed 800 acres of commercial long-grain rice, the standard variety promoted by the LSU Ag Center. He was a good farmer, a man who believed in technology and progress. He used the best fertilizers, the newest combines, the most effective pesticides. He laser-leveled his fields to a tolerance of 1 inch. He respected Elara's little garden plot, her strange black rice, but he treated it as a curiosity, a piece of folklore, a woman's hobby. Elara never argued. She just kept her seed, year after year, planting it by hand, harvesting it with a sickle, threshing it on a cypress plank her grandfather had made. She watched the water, she watched the moon, and she kept the knowledge of the Benoit Noir alive in the muscle memory of her hands. After Jean-Paul died and the 800 acres were leased out to a larger corporate farm to pay his debts, Elara was left with the house, the 12 acres, and the bag of seed. She lived on his modest life insurance policy, which was worth $50,000. In March of 2021, she took a third of that money, went to the St. Amelie Parish courthouse, and bought the Broussard sump. The arrival of Mark Thorne in St. Amelie Parish in January of 2021 was hailed as a sign of progress. Thorne was 34 years old, held a Master of Science in Agronomy from Texas A&M, and had spent the last 6 years as a regional sales director for Agrigen, one of the largest seed and chemical companies in the world. He was tall, confident, and wore a crisp, logo-embroidered polo shirt to every meeting. He was the face of the future. His job was to introduce Agrigen's newest product to the farmers of the parish, a genetically modified rice seed called Apex 7. He held a town hall meeting at the parish co-op on a Tuesday night. The room was packed. Over 150 farmers, most of them men in their 40s and 50s, sat in folding chairs, drinking stale coffee from styrofoam cups. They were facing a crisis. Fuel costs were up 40% in 2 years. Fertilizer prices had doubled. The commodity price for rice had been stagnant for a decade. They were caught in a vice grip of rising costs and flat revenues. They were desperate for an edge, any edge. Mark Thorne was offering one. He stood at a podium in front of a PowerPoint presentation. The first slide showed a graph with a green line soaring upward. Apex 7, he said, his voice resonating with the easy confidence of a man who has never been wrong, is not just a new seed, it's a new system. It's engineered for maximum glyphosate tolerance, which means you can spray over the top and eliminate weed pressure for pennies on the dollar. It has a 15% shorter growing season, getting your product to market faster. And most importantly, we are seeing an average yield increase of 22% over the leading commercial varieties. A murmur went through the crowd. 22%? That was not an edge. That was a revolution. Thorne clicked to the next slide, a spreadsheet dense with numbers. He talked about nitrogen uptake efficiency, stalk rigidity for reduced lodging, and milling yield. He used terms like phenotypic plasticity and optimized genetic pathways. He presented data from test plots in Arkansas, Mississippi, and Texas. The data was clear, overwhelming, and seductive. It promised a way out of the vice. The cost for a 50-pound bag of Apex 7 seed was $235, nearly double the price of conventional seed. But Thorne had an answer for that, too. He showed them the return on investment calculation. With the increased yield and the savings on herbicides, he projected a net profit increase of $112 per acre. For a farmer working 800 acres, that was nearly $90,000 in new profit. It was the answer to their prayers. At the end of the presentation, an old farmer named Bo Guidry, who had been farming the same land for 55 years, stood up. "Mr. Thorne," he said, his voice a gravelly Cajun drawl, "what about water? This new rice, she need more water or less?" Thorne smiled. It was a question he was prepared for. "That's the beauty of the Apex system, Bo. It's optimized for a drained field protocol. You plant into dry soil, which reduces seedling disease. You bring the flood on for 60 days, then you drain again for harvest. It gives you maximum control, no more guessing. You control the water, the weeds, the growth cycle. The system puts you in the driver's seat." The farmers nodded. Control. That's what they craved. For their entire lives, they had been at the mercy of the weather, the markets, the pests. A system that promised control was more than just a product. It was a philosophy. It was a promise of dominion. By the end of the meeting, over 80% of the rice acreage in Amelie Parish was committed to Apex 7 for the upcoming season. Mark Thorne was a hero. He had brought salvation in a 50-pound bag. Elara Benoit was not at that meeting. She was at home, running the dark, smooth grains of the Benoit Noir through her fingers, listening to the quiet hum of the night. 2 months later, Elara bought the swamp. The news spread through the parish like a slow flood. It was discussed over coffee at the dusty counter of the hardware store, in the pews after Sunday Mass, and over the crackle of CB radios in tractor cabs. The consensus was uniform. Poor Elara had finally lost her mind. Grief had addled her senses. Wasting good money on a swamp, it was a tragedy. Her grandson, Leo, felt the sting of the community's judgment most acutely. Leo was 22, a bright young man who had just graduated from the local community college with a degree in business administration. He loved his grandmother, but he was a product of his generation. He believed in progress, in data, in the gleaming promise of modernity that Mark Thorne represented. He dreamed of moving to Baton Rouge or New Orleans, getting a job in logistics or marketing, and leaving the mud and toil of the farm behind. He had sat in the back of the co-op meeting, awestruck by Thorne's presentation. His grandfather, Jean-Paul, would have loved it. He would have been the first in line to buy Apex 7. Now, his grandmother was becoming the parish laughingstock. He drove his truck down the gravel road to the Broussard sump a week after she bought it. He found her standing at the edge of the waterlogged property, not looking at it with despair, but with a deep, unnerving stillness. She held a long, thin rod of polished cypress wood, probing the dark soil. "Grand-mère?" Leo said, his voice gentle but laced with embarrassment. "What are you doing? Mr. Guidry told me you bought this place. It's a swamp. You can't farm here." Elara didn't turn around. She pushed the rod into the ground, pulled it out, and examined the tip. "The water knows where to go," she said, more to herself than to him. It remembers the old paths. That weekend, Mark Thorne paid her a visit. He drove his clean, white company pickup down her driveway, the Agrigen logo gleaming on the door. He found her on her porch, shelling butter beans into a metal bowl. He was polite, professional, and deeply concerned. He held a laminated sheet of paper. It was a soil analysis report for the Broussard sump, which he'd pulled from the parish archives. "Mrs. Benoit," he began, his tone a careful blend of respect and authority. "I came because I heard you purchased the old Broussard property. I wanted to share some data with you, just so you're aware of the challenges." He pointed to a series of numbers on the sheet. The soil pH is 5.2. That's highly acidic. The organic matter is over 15%, which will lock up nitrogen. And the hydrology, well, it's not suitable for any modern rice varietal. I project a 100% crop failure if you attempt to plant here. Elara looked up from her beans, her eyes clear and steady. She did not look at his paper. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne. That is kind of you to worry." Thorne pressed on, convinced he was helping her. "My company, Agrigen, we'd be happy to provide you with a full agronomic consultation, free of charge. We can develop a plan to remediate the soil. It would involve extensive lime application, probably 3 tons to the acre, and a significant investment in drainage tile. It would cost you about $60,000, but we could make about 15 of those acres productive in 3 to 5 years. Elara placed another handful of beans in the bowl. The metallic ping echoed in the quiet air. He saw he wasn't getting through. He tried a different tack. He tried to speak her language. He thought he was. "I'm just a well-meaning professional trying to help an old woman avoid a terrible mistake. The data says this won't work, Mrs. Benoit. It just won't." Elara finally set the bowl down. She looked at the young man, at his clean shirt and his confident eyes and his laminated sheet of data. She said, quietly, "My grandmother's data says it will." Thorne was stumped. It was the first time his logic had failed to land. He saw Leo standing by the steps, his face flushed with shame. The boy gave him an apologetic shrug. Thorne nodded, admitted defeat, and retreated to his truck. As he drove away, he saw the old woman and the boy in his rearview mirror. The boy was shaking his head. The old woman had already picked up her bowl and gone back to her beans. The work began in the spring of 2021. It was not farming as anyone in St. Amelie Parish understood it. There were no tractors, no plows, no laser levelers. Elara hired a man with a small backhoe, not to drain the land, but to accentuate what was already there. She walked the 40 acres for weeks with her cypress stick and a ball of twine, reading the subtle shifts in elevation, the flow of the water, the places where the cattails grew thickest. She wasn't imposing a grid on the land. She was discovering the one that already existed. The backhoe worked for 7 days, costing her $850. It dug a series of shallow, meandering channels, no more than 2 feet deep, connecting the lowest points of the property and guiding the excess water toward the coulee. It built up low, curving levees, not with imported dirt, but with the rich muck scooped from the channels. She wasn't fighting the water. She was negotiating with it. She was creating a passive irrigation system, powered by gravity and the memory of the land. When she was done, the 40 acres had been transformed into a mosaic of 36 small, irregularly shaped paddies, each one a slightly different elevation, each one connected to the whole. Leo helped her. He did it out of a sense of familial duty, but his heart wasn't in it. He spent his days wading through mud, fighting off mosquitoes, and wondering how he could explain this to his friends. His grandmother's methods were ancient, inscrutable. She would consult an almanac to decide when to flood a paddy. She would observe the flight patterns of dragonflies. She told him that the cypress knees were her fertilizer, that the algae blooms were her herbicide. It sounded like madness. Meanwhile, all around them, the rest of the parish was embracing the Apex 7 system with religious fervor. The air hummed with the roar of diesel engines. Massive 24-row planters moved across perfectly flat, dry fields, injecting the expensive seed with GPS-guided precision. Crop-dusting planes crisscrossed the sky, trailing plumes of glyphosate that settled like a fine mist over everything. It was a war on nature, and for the first year, the war was being won. The Apex 7 fields were pristine, uniform carpets of brilliant green, untroubled by a single weed. The farmers were thrilled. Mark Thorne drove the parish roads in his white pickup, nodding with satisfaction. His system was working. His data was correct. In her swamp, Elara and Leo planted the Benoit Noir by hand. They waded into the flooded paddies, broadcasting the seed with a rhythmic sweep of the arm, a motion passed down through generations. It was grueling, slow work. It took them 2 weeks to seed the 40 acres. Their only costs were the backhoe rental and $270 for fuel. They bought no fertilizer, no herbicide, no pesticide. Her total investment for the first year of planting was $1,120. The farmer who leased her late husband's 800 acres spent over $150,000 on seed and chemicals alone. The Benoit Noir grew slowly, erratically. Some paddies were thick with it, others were sparse. Strange aquatic plants grew alongside it, plants Elara didn't pull. They belong here, she told Leo. They hold the soil and feed the fish. She had stocked the channels with a few buckets of bluegill and crawfish. They are our pest control, she explained. By July, her fields looked wild, chaotic, and deeply unproductive compared to the manicured perfection of the Apex 7 farms. Leo felt a familiar pang of shame. His grandmother wasn't a farmer, she was a gardener, tending her beautiful, pointless swamp. The first harvest, in the fall of 2021, was meager. They harvested it by hand, with sickles, and threshed it on an old tarp. They got just enough to replenish their seed stock and a few hundred pounds to store for themselves. It was, by any commercial standard, a failure. The second year, 2022, brought the drought. It began in May, with a string of 100-degree days and no rain. By June, the parish was 10 inches below its average rainfall. The Bayou Teche, the lifeblood of the region's agriculture, began to shrink, its banks pulling back to expose cracked, sun-baked mud. For the Apex 7 farmers, the drought was a catastrophe. Their drained field protocol, so efficient in a normal year, became an anchor dragging them down. The soil, stripped of its organic matter and baked by the sun, had no capacity to hold moisture. They had to pump massive amounts of water from the dwindling bayou just to maintain the flood. Their fuel costs skyrocketed. Fights broke out at the parish council over water rights. Mark Thorne was stressed. His models hadn't accounted for a drought of this severity. He advised farmers to increase their pumping schedules and apply a new nutrient supplement to help the plants cope with the heat stress. It was more money, more inputs, more fighting against the grain of nature. The system, so perfect on paper, was proving to be brittle. But in Elara Benoit's swamp, something strange was happening. Nothing. The 40 acres, which had been a reservoir of water for a century, did not seem to notice the drought. The peaty, black soil, so maligned in Thorne's report, acted like a sponge, holding on to the winter rains. The water level in her paddies dropped by only a few inches. The channels she had dug now served to circulate the water she had, keeping it from stagnating. The cypress trees provided shade, reducing evaporation. The entire system was a closed loop, a self-regulating oasis. Her rice, the Benoit Noir, didn't just survive, it thrived. The stalks grew taller and thicker than the year before. The seed heads were heavier. Leo began to see. He started spending more time in the swamp, not just working, but watching. He saw how the crawfish stirred the mud, oxygenating the roots. He saw how the bluegill ate the mosquito larvae. He saw how the lotus plants shaded the water, preventing algae from choking the rice. It wasn't a collection of individual plants. It was a community. It was a system far more complex and elegant than the one Mark Thorne sold. One evening, he was cleaning out the old shed behind his grandmother's house and found a small, leather-bound journal. It belonged to his great-great-grandmother, Celestine, the one who had brought the seed. The pages were filled with elegant, spidery script, written in a mix of French and English. It wasn't a diary of feelings, it was a diary of data. There were meticulous records of planting dates, correlated not with a calendar, but with the phases of the moon and the first appearance of certain migratory birds. They were drawings of the rice at different stages of growth, notes on which aquatic plants grew as good companions and which did not. There were records of droughts and floods going back to the 1880s, and notes on how the rice had responded. It was a 100-year-long research study. It was his grandmother's data. He brought the journal to her that night. She took it, held it to her chest, and nodded, as if she had been waiting for him to find it. "The land teaches you," she said, "if you know how to listen." That fall, they harvested nearly 4,000 pounds of rice. They sold half of it to a specialty food distributor in New Orleans for $8 a pound. They made $16,000. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a profit. A quiet, startling profit. The third year, 2023, the rains returned. The drought broke, and a wet, humid spring settled over St. Amelie Parish. The Apex 7 farmers breathed a sigh of relief. With water plentiful again, they were anticipating a record harvest. They doubled down, planting fence row to fence row, investing even more heavily in Agrogen's full suite of products. Mark Thorne, his confidence restored, declared the drought a once-in-a-generation anomaly. The system was back on track. But the wet, humid conditions that were so good for the rice were also perfect for something else. Let me tell you about Rhizoctonia solani. It's a fungus, the cause of a disease called sheath blight. It thrives in warm, damp environments with dense plant populations. For most of rice farming history, it was a nuisance, but not a plague. The wide spacing of traditional planting methods and the genetic diversity of heirloom seeds kept it in check. But a modern, high-yield monoculture, a vast, unbroken field of genetically identical plants growing thick and close together, is not a field. It's a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The spark came in late July. It started on a farm near the southern edge of the parish. A few brown, irregular lesions appeared on the sheaths of the Apex 7 rice, just above the waterline. The farmer thought it was fertilizer burn. A week later, the lesions had spread, girdling the plants, and the field was dotted with patches of dying rice. Within 2 weeks, it was an epidemic. The fungus, finding a perfect, uniform host with no genetic resistance, swept through the parish. The very uniformity that was Apex 7's strength had become its catastrophic weakness. The crop dusters came back, this time spraying fungicides at a cost of $45 per acre per application. They sprayed once. They sprayed twice. It did nothing. The blight was too aggressive, the conditions too perfect. The farmers watched, helpless, as their beautiful, uniform fields turned into rotting, stinking messes. Mark Thorne was in a panic. He flew in specialists from Agrigen's headquarters. They took samples, ran tests, and held emergency meetings. Their conclusion was blunt. It was a near total loss. The blight had exploited the genetic uniformity of the crop. The system, designed for maximum yield in a controlled environment, had no resilience against an unexpected shock. It was a rigid, brittle thing, and it had shattered. In Elara Benoit's swamp, the sheath blight never took hold. It couldn't. There was no vast, uniform field. There was a patchwork of 36 individual paddies, separated by levees, channels of open water, and stands of native plants. The Benoit Noir, with its generations of genetic diversity, was not uniformly susceptible. Some plants got sick, but their neighbors, with slightly different genes, did not. The wide spacing of the plants allowed for air circulation, keeping the humidity at the stalk level down. The ecosystem itself provided the resilience. The blight found no purchase. It was an enemy designed to fight an army, and it had stumbled into a swamp full of scattered, well-defended villages. Elara and Leo watched the crop dusters flying over their neighbors' fields and said nothing. They just kept working, their sickles flashing in the sun as they began to harvest the heaviest, healthiest crop of Benoit Noir they had ever seen. The annual weigh-in at the St. Amelie Parish Co-op had always been a time of communal celebration. It was a harvest festival, a time for backslapping, storytelling, and friendly rivalries over yield per acre. But in October of 2023, the mood was funereal. One by one, farmers pulled their trucks onto the industrial scale, their faces grim. The numbers that flashed on the digital display told the story. Yields were down 70%, 80%, in some cases 90%. What little they had harvested was poor quality, the grains discolored by the fungus. The co-op manager, a man named Thomas Hebert, who had known most of these farmers his whole life, didn't have the heart to look them in the eye. It was a bloodbath. Most of them wouldn't break even. Many would face foreclosure. Mark Thorne was there, standing off to the side, his Agrigen polo shirt looking wilted. He held the clipboard, but he wasn't writing anything down. His face was pale. His system had failed. His beautiful, soaring green line had crashed into the ground. He had sold them a promise of control, and they had lost everything. Then, just after noon, Elara Benoit's 1998 Ford Ranger rattled up to the scale. Leo was at the wheel, his face set with a quiet determination. Elara sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap. The bed of the truck was filled with hand-stitched canvas sacks, bulging with the dark, heavy grains of the Benoit Noir. A hush fell over the assembled farmers. They stopped their grim conversations and turned to watch. They weren't laughing anymore. They were curious, confused, and maybe, for the first time, a little afraid of what they didn't know. Thomas Hebert, the manager, walked over to the truck. He looked at Elara, then at the sacks of rice. He ran a hand through the grains. They were perfect, clean, whole, and heavy. He nodded to Leo, who drove the truck fully onto the scale. The farmers leaned in, watching the red digital numbers flicker as the computer calculated the weight. For a long moment, the numbers settled. Thomas stared at it. He checked it twice. Then he stepped back and cleared his throat. "Elara Benoit," he announced, his voice carrying across the silent yard. 11,251 pounds. A collective gasp went through the crowd. From 40 acres. It was a respectable yield, not a record breaker by any means in a normal year. But this was not a normal year. It was a miracle. But the number that came next was the one that broke the parish's heart and remade its future. A chef from a famous New Orleans restaurant had heard about the Benoit Noir and had driven up that morning. He had tasted the rice. He had seen the fields. He had made an offer, bypassing the commodity market entirely. Thomas Hebert held up the contract. He read the price. Sold at $8.75 a pound. There was no cheering. There was only a profound, echoing silence. The farmers did the math in their heads. They were experts at this kind of math. Their lives depended on it. 11,251 pounds times $8.75. The number was absurd. It was impossible. It hung in the humid Louisiana air, a ghost of a number that felt more real than the dirt under their feet. $98,450. The crowd didn't move. They just stared at the old woman in the old truck, at the sacks of black rice, at the number that defied everything they knew. Beau Guidry, the old farmer who had questioned Thorne at that first meeting, slowly took off his hat and held it to his chest. It was a gesture of surrender, of respect, of awe. One by one, other men did the same. They weren't just looking at a successful harvest. They were looking at the ghost of a knowledge they had willingly abandoned. They had traded resilience for efficiency, and they had gotten neither. Elara Benoit had chosen a different path. She had bet on the slow, patient, complex wisdom of the swamp. And she had won. Later that afternoon, after the contracts were signed and the truck was unloaded, Mark Thorne found Elara and Leo by their truck, preparing to leave. He looked like a different man. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by a deep, searching humility. He wasn't holding a clipboard. His hands were empty. "Mrs. Benoit," he said, his voice quiet. "I don't understand. My system is more efficient. The data, the inputs, the genetics, it's all optimized for maximum output." Elara finished tying a knot on a loose bit of twine on a tarp. She looked at him, and her eyes held no triumph, only a deep, abiding sadness, as if she were looking at a lost child. She said, "Your system is efficient at one thing. This one is efficient at surviving." Leo stood beside her. He was holding the small, indigo-dyed cloth bag that had started it all. He met Thorne's gaze, and for the first time he felt no shame, no embarrassment, only a profound sense of purpose. He was the inheritor not of 40 acres of swamp, but of a story, a legacy, a way of seeing the world. The most important line was spoken later, quietly, on the drive home. As they turned off the main highway onto their gravel road, Elara looked out at the dying fields of their neighbors. "It's not their fault," she said. "They just forgot how to listen." In the years that followed, St. Amelie Parish changed. It didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, like the turning of a season. The next spring, Beau Guidry and 2 other farmers came to Elara's door, hat in hand, and asked if she might spare a little of her seed. She gave it to them, along with a copy of Celestine's notes on water and moons. The year after that, a dozen more farmers came. They started calling themselves the Swamp Farmers. They formed their own little co-op, sharing knowledge, helping each other dig channels and build contour levees. They were farming less land, but they were making more money. The soil was improving. The crawfish and the birds were coming back. Mark Thorne left Agrigen a year after the blight. The last anyone heard, he was working for a small nonprofit in coastal North Carolina, helping restore native wetland ecosystems. Apex 7 was quietly pulled from the market, a victim of its own success. Leo never left for Baton Rouge. He took over the 40 acres and, with his grandmother's guidance, expanded their operation to a neighboring 60-acre tract of marginal land. He became an expert reader of the land, a student of the water. He kept his great-great-grandmother's journal in a cedar box, and on planting days, he would carry the old indigo seed bag, now patched and worn, out to the paddies. It was his data. What is rigid breaks. What is uniform is fragile. That is the lesson of the blight. But there is a deeper lesson, the one held in the dark grains of the Benoit Noir. It is that the most advanced technology is sometimes the one that has learned to listen for 1,000 years. It is that resilience is not found in the pursuit of a single, optimized outcome, but in the embrace of a messy, complex, and living system. The world is not a spreadsheet. It is a swamp, full of life and memory and interconnected relationships. You cannot conquer it. You can only learn to be a part of it. What survives is what adapts, and what adapts is what has remembered the past while making a home for the future.